Identity verified. You have entered SYB3R. Welcome back. I am JAX. This is SYB3R. Last time we traced a single weaponized Salesforce integration that became a multi-company breach pipeline, Betterment, Aura, Carnival, companies most people had never heard were connected at all. The lesson was simple. The vendor was not the weakness. The connection was. Tonight, the same principle at a different scale. A bank, a server, a firewall configured in a way that allowed it to make a connection it was never supposed to make. One request to one address. That address was not on the internet. It was inside the server itself, and the response gave the attacker everything she needed to walk out with over 100 million records from one of the largest banks in the United States. The storage was not the weakness. The connection was. Capital One operated a web application firewall on servers hosted in Amazon Web Services. A web application firewall sits in front of web applications and inspects incoming traffic, filtering malicious requests before they reach the back end. In Capital One's deployment, this firewall was misconfigured in a way that allowed it to process and forward certain crafted requests that it should have dropped. The misconfiguration created an opening for server-side request forgery, a class of vulnerability where an attacker tricks a server into making outbound requests on their behalf, reaching destinations the attacker could never touch directly. This was not a zero-day. This was not a sophisticated exploit chain requiring novel research or custom tooling. It was a configuration error on infrastructure that processed sensitive financial data for one of the largest banks in the United States. A defender reviewing the firewall rules at the time would have seen permissive outbound routing that allowed the server to reach internal addresses. The rule set lacked restrictions on linked local destinations. The gap was small. The surface it exposed was not. The attacker sent a crafted request through the misconfigured firewall that directed the server to contact a specific address. That address was 169.254.169.254. In AWS environments, this is the Instance Metadata Service. Every elastic compute cloud instance can query this address to retrieve information about itself, including the IAM role credentials assigned to that instance. The metadata service is designed to be accessible only from within the instance itself. It listens on a linked local address that is not routable across the public internet. The server-side request forgery tricked the server into making that call on the attacker's behalf. The server, which was inside the AWS environment and had legitimate access to the metadata endpoint, sent the request and returned the response to the attacker. No authentication was required to query the metadata service under the version running at the time. No token was needed. No second step was enforced. The request was simple. The response contained live credentials. A single HTTP GET to a linked local address returned the keys to the kingdom. The metadata service returned the IAM role credentials associated with the Capital One server. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. These credentials are temporary access keys that the instance uses to interact with other AWS services on behalf of the application running on it. The role assigned to this server had permissions that were broader than necessary for its operational function. Instead of being scoped to the minimum resources the server required, the role granted access to a wider set of AWS services and storage locations across the environment. A defender, reviewing the IAM policy at the time, would have seen a role attached to an EC2 instance with permissions spanning multiple S3 buckets beyond what the application needed. The principle of least privilege had not been enforced. AWS CloudTrail logs would later show API calls authenticated by these credentials, accessing resources unrelated to the server's operational purpose. The credentials were live, they were valid, and they carried enough authority to reach into storage containing data on over 100 million people who had applied for credit cards at Capital One. With the IAM credentials in hand, the attacker authenticated to AWS as the role assigned to the Capital One server. Those credentials permitted calls to S3, Amazon's object storage service. Capital One stored credit card application data in S3 buckets. The attacker used the stolen credentials to enumerate and access those buckets, downloading files containing application records that customers had submitted over years of business operations. The access looked legitimate from AWS's perspective. The requests were authenticated with valid IAM credentials associated with a Capital One-owned role. CloudTrail, AWS's API logging service, would have recorded list buckets and get object calls under the assumed role name. But because the credentials belonged to the bank's own infrastructure, the activity blended into the normal operational pattern of the environment. The exfiltration began in March of 2019 and continued without detection for months. The data moved out through the same channel that the bank's own servers used for legitimate operations. The exfiltrated data spanned credit card applications submitted between 2005 and early 2019. Capital One later disclosed that the breach affected approximately 100 million individuals in the United States and approximately 6 million individuals in Canada. The stolen files contained application data, including names, addresses, dates of birth, credit scores, and in some cases, social security numbers and bank account numbers provided during the application process. Roughly 140,000 social security numbers were exposed. Approximately 80,000 bank account numbers were included. Capital One stated that no credit card account numbers or passwords were compromised. The data was application data, not transaction data. But application data is enough to enable identity theft at scale. Names, dates of birth, addresses, social security numbers, and bank account numbers together constitute a full identity profile. 100 million records is not a data breach. It is a population census of everyone who ever asked a bank for credit over a 14-year period. The breach ran undetected for approximately roughly 4 months, from March through July of 2019. The attacker maintained access using credentials that had been harvested in a single request. There's no indication in the public record that the credentials were rotated during this period. The temporary credentials returned by the metadata service have a limited lifespan, but the metadata service could be queried again at any time to refresh them, and the SSRF path remained open. For roughly 4 months, a defender monitoring the environment would have needed to distinguish between legitimate API calls made by the EC2 instance in the course of normal operations and illegitimate calls made by an external actor using the same credentials. The CloudTrail logs held the evidence, but without alerting rules keyed to anomalous access patterns, unusual source IP addresses, or out-of-hours activity against the S3 buckets, the logs sat unread. The breach was not detected by Capital One's internal security team. It was not detected by AWS. It was detected because the attacker talked. The attacker was Paige Thompson, a former Amazon Web Services engineer. Thompson had worked at AWS, the same cloud provider that hosted Capital One's infrastructure. Her knowledge of AWS internals, including the Instance Metadata Service, and how IAM roles functioned within the environment, was directly relevant to the attack path she chose. She understood the architecture she was targeting. Because she had worked inside that architecture, she knew which address to query. She knew what the response would contain. She knew what those credentials could reach. Thompson operated under a traceable online handle. She did not obscure her identity behind multiple layers of anonymity. She used the same handle across platforms, connecting her real identity to her online activity in ways that would later make the investigation straightforward. Her technical knowledge gave her the ability to execute the attack. Her operational security decisions gave investigators the trail they needed. The combination of deep internal knowledge and poor operational discipline defined the trajectory of the entire case. Thompson posted about the stolen data on GitHub, the code hosting platform, and on Slack, the workplace messaging application. On GitHub, she uploaded files and made statements connecting herself to the breach. The posts were visible to other users on the platform. She used a handle that was traceable to her through other online activity, including social media accounts and prior technical contributions that linked the handle to her real identity. A security researcher browsing GitHub encountered Thompson's posts. The researcher saw files and statements indicating that a breach had occurred at Capital One. The researcher did not ignore it. They documented what they found and reported it to Capital One's bug bounty program in July of 2019. The report reached the bank through a channel designed to receive vulnerability disclosures from external researchers. The breach was not discovered by a firewall alert or a SYM correlation rule or an anomaly detection engine. It was discovered because an outsider read a public post and picked up the phone. Capital One received the report in July of 2019. The bank engaged external forensic investigators and notified federal law enforcement. Within days of the report being submitted, the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrested Paige Thompson. The timeline from external report to arrest was short. The breach had lasted roughly 4 months. The investigation that ended it took days. Capital One publicly disclosed the breach on July 29, 2019. The bank estimated costs between $150 million and $300 million, including customer notifications, credit monitoring services, legal costs, and infrastructure remediation. The disclosure triggered regulatory scrutiny, class action litigation, and congressional inquiries into cloud security practices at financial institutions. 1. Misconfigured firewall. 100 million records, up to $300 million in estimated damage. The cost of a single configuration error measured in 9 figures. In 2022, a federal jury in the Western District of Washington convicted Thompson on charges of wire fraud and unauthorized access to a protected computer. That unauthorized access charge is the hacking conviction. What the jury did not convict her of was aggravated identity theft. The distinction mattered. The prosecution argued that Thompson intended to use the stolen data for financial gain. The defense maintained that she accessed the data, but did not intend to distribute or monetize it. The split verdict reflected the complexity of proving intent in a data exfiltration case. Unauthorized access was documented and confirmed through CloudTrail logs and forensic evidence. Wire fraud was established through the transmission of the stolen data across state lines. But the jury was not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Thompson's actions met the legal threshold for identity theft or the specific hacking charges brought by the prosecution. She was sentenced in 2023. The conviction stood. The most serious charges did not. Following the breach, AWS accelerated the rollout of IMDS version 2, the second version of the Instance Metadata Service. IMDS version 2 introduced a token-based mechanism. To retrieve metadata, a client must first issue a PUT request to obtain a session token, then include that token in a subsequent GET request to the metadata endpoint. This two-step process blocks simple server-side request forgery attacks, because a basic SSRF that issues a GET request without the token receives nothing in return. The fix was sound. The adoption was slow. For years after the Capital One breach, IMDS version 1, the vulnerable version, remained the default or was still configured on a significant number of EC2 instances across AWS customer environments. The same vulnerability path that Thompson exploited remained accessible to anyone who could find another misconfigured server with an SSRF and an IMDS version 1 endpoint. The patch existed. The lesson was documented in every cloud security briefing for years. The configuration change required was minimal, and thousands of servers continued to run the old version. The connection that should never have existed was closed. The connections that still exist remain open. What address did the attacker's server-side request forgery request target to retrieve IAM credentials from the Capital One server? Option A, the public IP address of Capital One's primary domain. Option B, the AWS Instance Metadata Service at 169.254.169.254. Option C, the S3 bucket endpoint directly. The answer is B. How was the Capital One breach ultimately discovered after going undetected for over 100 days? Option A, Capital One's internal SIEM flagged anomalous S3 access patterns during a routine audit. Option B, AWS notified Capital One that the IAM role credentials were being used from an unusual IP address. Option C, a security researcher found posts about the stolen data on GitHub and reported it to Capital One's bug bounty program. The answer is C. The Capital One breach was not a sophisticated operation. It was one misconfigured firewall, one internal request to an address that should never have been reachable, and one set of credentials that should never have been so broadly scoped. The attacker was a former AWS engineer who understood the architecture she was targeting. She was caught not by the bank's security tools, but because she posted about the breach in public under a name that traced back to her. For full attack, kill chain breakdowns of this breach and others like it, our sister channel, What the Kill Chain, maps every step of real intrusions from initial access through exfiltration. Subscribe to SYB3R for the next transmission. Stay dark, stay vigilant. Next time, someone stole 119,756 Bitcoin from the Bitfinex exchange. For 6 years, most of the stolen coins sat largely untouched, while their value grew from $72 million to $4.5 billion. The trail went cold. Investigators moved on, until a woman calling herself the Crocodile of Wall Street started posting rap videos on YouTube. The password was in a cloud backup. The door was already open. Transmission complete. Subscribe to maintain access. Stay dark, stay vigilant.